So you're here today. I hope you're in the right place. You're here today. We're going to be talking about ethical considerations with kids and teens. Myself and Rachel have worked with this age group quite extensively. So we are going to give you some information, but then we're also going to incorporate some of our own work. You will leave with resources as well. So there'll be some screeners that you can take home and utilize for your practice as well. And then, of course, there's going to be time for Q&A at the end. But we're going to just kind of go ahead and settle in and get started. Another thing, if you attend today and tomorrow, because today is ethical considerations with kids and teens, tomorrow is ethical considerations with artificial intelligence. We have Ernesto coming. He is really an expert, and he is in California, so he'll be joining us very early on the West Coast tomorrow. If you attend both days, you will be entered to win. We have a prize if you are here both days, and that will be some sort of swag that can have your credentials. So if you're like an LICSW or you're an LPC, we will be offering one winner to get some swag. So if you're attending both days, you have that to look forward to. Okay, so you're here for ethical considerations with kids and teens. I hope that's why you're here. So I'm going to do introductions. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to introduce Rachel, and then we're going to kind of set the groundwork for what are we going to do today. We want this to be interactive, so no question should be, don't think that any question's silly. With kids, I feel like everything's a question mark, right? And every kid is different. So please, 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 we want questions for the Q&A at the end. So go ahead and throw those into the chat as they come up. So let me just give you a little bit of introductions here. My name is Megan Mitchell. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I was working in DC. I just moved about a month ago now, back to Michigan, where I'm from. And I have been licensed at the clinical level for over 10 years now, and primarily working with children. I have my own private practice called Brain Space Wellness, and I'm working towards my play therapy credential. I work a lot with kiddos. This is really my space. And then, of course, some of you may know me from Agents of Change Social Work Test Prep. We have now moved into the training space. So we are here with Agents of Change Training to offer CEs. And I love these type of events because I love teaching. I love learning along with all of you. And then also I am a DSW student, very, very close to being done. I finish in May at SUNY Buffalo. So that's a little bit about me. And let me give you Rachel's background. So Rachel Yutzi was my coworker for many years. So I'm really happy to have her here. She's also a licensed clinical social worker and grief and trauma psychotherapist. So that's really her specialty is trauma. And she does a lot also with OCD, which is really cool too. But she does a lot of things. She treats a wide range of issues: trauma, grief, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Like I said, she's also a specialist in OCD. She's worked with children, adolescents, adults. She uses CBT, trauma-focused CBT, and EMDR. And she is in a group private practice in Maryland now, but Elvard, Baker and Associates. And she works with complex developmental and sexual trauma, grief, loss, and dissociative disorders. She is also a DSW student. She is at NYU, and she just started this semester. So I'm very excited for her. And she is very into trauma-informed care and clinical education. She does clinical supervision and is very passionate about that work too. So we are very excited to have Rachel here with us today as well. And what's really cool is I work a lot with younger children, and Rachel works a lot with adolescents. We both go in and out of the different age groups, but we thought that would be a nice pairing today because we've got the young children expertise and the adolescent and teen expertise too. So that's a little bit about our backgrounds. Okay, here's our learning objectives for today. What are you going to learn? This is an ethics training, right? So confidentiality and consent. How can you implement best practices for getting informed consent, maintaining confidentiality? I will say we're going to try to keep this as exciting as possible, but it's ethics, so some of the stuff is dry and boring, but it's essential, right? You have to know your ethics to be working in a therapeutic setting. So we're going to talk about best practices for that and what are the legal and ethical standards. That's really what we're here today. We want you to make sure you never lose your license. So that is first and foremost. We'll talk about building rapport and repairing ruptures, especially with kids. This can be sometimes the most easy thing. You can easily build rapport, but sometimes our teens are a little bit trickier. So we're going to talk about ways you can effectively build techniques to work and maintain trust with children and adolescents. And then when there is a rupture, maybe you have to report or you have to break confidentiality. How do you rebuild that therapeutic alliance so you can continue doing really good clinical work? Trigger warning. I say this now, I mean, it is an ethics training and it's social work, so take that for what it is. But we will be talking, because we're going to have to talk about confidentiality, reporting. There is some content that talks about self-harm, suicide, and risky behavior. So just FYI, if this is something that you need to prioritize your well-being and your care, please do so. So you guys know yourself best, but just FYI, if this comes up in some of the cases that we're going to talk about and some of the areas we're going to talk about, it's some heavy stuff, but it's necessary because this does happen with our children and teens. So just FYI. Okay. More learning objectives, assessing for higher levels of care. Rachel's going to talk us through a case where she had to determine higher levels of care, and her client actually worked through the different levels of care. So how do you assess if maybe outpatient isn't meeting their needs and they maybe need something more intensive, like intensive outpatient or residential? And she's going to talk about some screening she does and some tools she uses. We're going to talk about self-harm and safety planning. So we'll talk about some statistics with self-harm. We'll talk about what does self-harm look like in younger children. We know what it looks like in teens, but it does happen in young children. And how do you make a safety plan for these kiddos and with their parents? Okay, that was the objectives. I'm not going to read this for you. You can go ahead, but we're going to talk about, like, who are these kids and these teens we work with? They are Gen Z and Gen Alpha. If you didn't know the generational terms, we're going to talk about confidentiality and consent, building rapport and ruptures. We will have a 10-minute break halfway, so don't worry. Assessing for higher levels of care, self-harm and safety planning, and then help. Okay, I have all this information. What do I do? What do I do when I'm in an ethical dilemma? We hope today you will leave with some skills that when you're in these tricky situations, they are tricky, they are hard. What do you do? How can you work through these things? And then we'll, of course, end with a Q&A. So that was a lot of words, a lot of talking. I do want to start with a little picture here. I pulled up some pictures. I asked Rachel, I asked some people, when you think of working with Gen Z and Gen Alpha kiddos, what do you think about? So we got our Taylor Swift bracelets. We got our Crocs and socks, right? We've got some influencers down here. We got kiddos on their phones, because this is a generation that is totally dependent on technology. So this was just kind of to get the juices flowing of, if you work with kids and teens, like, you might have seen some of this stuff, right? I had a whole discussion with a kid that he was so excited to get his Crocs that he had saved money for. So that was a big talking point, that we were so excited about Crocs. But I've made these bracelets with kiddos and teens, and I actually made one this week. So this stuff does come up. It's you've seen it, I'm sure. So let's do a check-in. Do you work with kids first? You can utilize the chat. I just kind of want to get a pulse. Maybe you're taking this because you don't work with kids and you're like, hey, I just want to learn more. Do you work with kiddos and teens? What someone said no, thank God. I feel that. In your work, what is the best part about working with kids, and what is the hardest part about working with kids? So do you work with kids? And then if you do, what's the best part and what's the hardest part? I'll give you guys some time. I like that we have a mix, because I think it's really good when you do take trainings outside of the population you work with. That's how we learn our skill and grow our skills. So some people are saying hardest part is getting them to engage. That that I've sat in many silent sessions before. Give you all some time to kind of put your stuff in the chat. Someone said teenage girls are especially challenging. I will probably agree with that. Someone says working with the parents can be difficult. I always say I work with kids, and I don't individually work with adults, but I work with parents, so I do work with adults, because you can't work with kiddos without working with their parents. Someone said they love how open and honest they are. Yes, right? They will tell us like it is. And then good, I'm laughing because some of the stuff they tell me sometimes. Someone said the hardest part is keeping up with interventions or ideas that they'd be engaged in. Sometimes I'm like throwing everything at the wall, just hoping something will stick for them. And then you can go that way. So Rachel's going to talk about some ideas. Let's see. Social emotional groups, awesome. Parents and hearing disclosures. The disclosures never get easier. I will say that they never get easier. You just get more skilled to be able to respond to them. Like I remember when I was first getting disclosures and I did not know how to properly respond. I had to manage my own self. There was a lot going on. Yes, keeping them engaged. Parents, those of you that work with kids, how many would you say the parents are the most challenging part? I would say the parents are, for me, sometimes harder to work with than the children. People said, I don't know how much to share with parents. That's great. We're going to talk about that today. Very, very good stuff in the chat. So I'm going to let Rachel come off mute. Rachel, what is for you the best part about working with kids and teens and the hardest part?
Yeah, so one, I love the challenging teenage girls. I say the angrier the better. Like they're just very fun. I think the hardest part of kids for me is the parents, just because there's so many expectations coming into therapy, and we have to manage those expectations. And we're also modeling for both kids and their parents how to have some of those interactions. Um, and I do think the best part is that they're just energetic, they're funny, they're honest, they have a lot to give the world, and they also just like have so much untapped potential. um and I really love that. And I think, I mean, as we already talked about, I work a lot in sexual trauma, and so disclosures are really hard, and we'll talk about that more obviously, but I just want to validate that like disclosures to kids and from kids and disclosures then to parents can be exceptionally hard in any area. But I think of them particularly in my work, and yeah, they're not fun. That's not a fun time.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I would say the best, I am very close to becoming a registered play therapist. For me, the best part is play. I'm a very playful person. Rachel knows, like I have lots of toys and fun things. So getting to connect, if you are working with young, this is now of course from the younger children lens, but I have some teens that can play just as well too, and it's fun. If you work with younger children, play is really powerful. Play is really, really powerful. They don't yet really have the words. I'm not going to do a talk session with a 5-year-old, but we get in the playroom and you can see so much going on. So play is really, really fun. That's one of the most fun parts, is being playful and getting to see from their perspective how they interact with the world. Hardest part is challenging parents that maybe their expectations don't align with what we can do as therapists. And something I would think, for me, I was thinking about this yesterday, what I wanted to say. The hardest part for me is when parents don't see their children for who their children really are. They have this expectation, I want my kid to be this certain way. And they're just, it's very unfortunate when they don't see their kids for who they are, and then their kid suffers for it. So I have to do a lot of work with like, yes, you have this vision and this goal for your child, but that's your vision and goal. That's not your child's vision and goal. So that can be very, very hard, and having to find a way to give the child the voice and not have everything demanded and run by the parents. So it's a very tricky balance to maintain. So yes. Okay, so that's our check-in. I'm glad that some of you are like, God, no, I don't work with kids. And then I'm glad some of you do have experience with kids. So we have a nice array. So if you don't work with kids, even if you work with kids, go ask away. But we will have some really good discussions. I think you guys brought up a lot of points that we're going to cover today too. Like, how do I handle this? How do I handle parents versus confidentiality and reporting? So we're going to get to all that. So Gen Alpha, these are our youngest clients. How many of you are familiar with like these terms? Obviously, like we know, like there's millennials and boomers. They call me boomers all the time. I'm not a boomer, I'm a millennial, but they call me that. How many of you are familiar with the generational terms? Gen Alpha, that's the youngest, and then Gen Z. I'm sure you all have heard of Gen Z, like people talk about it all the time, but Gen Alpha is a newer term that I just kind of probably heard about in the past 6 months. So Gen Alpha is kiddos born from 2010 onwards. If you are like me, this will age you real quick. You're like, wow, 2010 onwards. So Gen Alpha, they are about, let's see, what, 14 and under. So they were born entirely in the 21st century with technology. They don't know a world without technology. So that's important to know, right? You are going to see cell phones. You're going to see, they know TikTok, they know YouTube, they know probably, they were grown up on technology. They know artificial intelligence already, right? So digital learning is a big part of, yes, people are saying iPad time, YouTube. We even have Gen Alphas that are influencers. So there's child influencers now, right? Like this is the life that they are raised in. So they've been exposed to screens and smart devices from birth. So remember, like back when they're like, babies are swiping, right? This is Gen Alpha, because this is what they were. And then you also have to think how much of their time was spent in COVID, where they either were doing virtual learning or parents had to work and they had to put them on screens, like, right? That just was the reality of what it is. So that's Gen Alpha. They are our youngest kiddos. What do we want to know about these Gen Alphas? And this is their little sign. It's an alpha sign. They interact with technology daily, minute to minute. So they are very intuitive with tech. It's not, they teach me too sometimes. Like I had a client that's like, did you know you can change the accent of your Siri on your phone? I was like, no. And so they showed me that, right? They do voice memos. They can do lots of different things. They started screen time at a very young age. Like I said, some are even child influencers who make millions of dollars based on using technology. They very much learn in schools on learning platforms. So like I had a kid tell me they don't have textbooks anymore. They just completely do everything. They're in the classroom, but they are on their computers a lot. So they know a lot about augmented reality, virtual reality. We can say they're pretty tech savvy. And then they're global citizens, aka they've had exposure to information at a very quick and high-paced level. So that's a good and a bad thing, right? What are conversations sometimes we have to have with parents? Like, maybe they shouldn't be completely unsupervised on technology. These are some of the conversations we as clinicians have to have, because they do live in a world of technology, and we know that that's a scary place sometimes, and it does need supervision. So that's Gen Alpha. Gen Z, I'm sure how many of you are familiar with hearing the term Gen Z? I feel like they sometimes get a lot of airtime. Yes, people are saying yes, they've heard of Gen Z. I heard of Gen Z. I just started hearing about Gen Alpha. So Gen Z are those born between 1997 and 2012. Remember, these are like roughly, so 2010 was Gen Alpha, but these are right now, these are generally high schoolers, college-aged kids. They follow the millennials. They know technology, but it's not as pervasive as the Gen Alphas. Obviously, they know smartphones, high-speed internet. I laugh because when I went to college, I had to use an Ethernet. We did not have Wi-Fi. They grew up with having access to internet, the Gen Zs. They generally were kids when TikTok, Instagram, YouTube came out. So they were not babies and toddlers when this came up, but they were kids, middle schoolers. So they got to go through all of that as they were developing into adolescence. So that's a little bit about Gen Z and what are some, this is obviously just characteristics. This is not everyone. They love memes, GIFs, and short form videos. They will always be telling me, like, have you seen this meme? Have you seen this GIF? And I'm like, I'm very uncool because I don't know what you're talking about. They grew up with smartphones and they grew up with social media. So that's very common. There are lots of influencers from Gen Z. I would say most influencers on TikTok, Instagram are Gen Zers. How many of you work with kids and have kids come and say, I'm diagnosing myself with X, Y, or Z diagnosis because I saw it on social media? I'm like, tell me more about how you think you have a personality disorder when you're 12, right? So they do actually are getting a lot of their information from social media. So that's conversations we have to have too. Where is your source of information? People are saying all the time they get this, right? It's a good thing and a bad thing. Double-edged sword, right? That's great. We're talking about mental health more, but let's back up a little bit here on who is posting this information. So they're on the social media a lot. How many of you work with kids or teens and you've had sessions where you are discussing how there has been drama or there's been conflict due to social media posts or what people are doing on social media? Right? Like, so and so posted this video, it's causing all these problems. It does cause a lot of conflict with peers and peer groups. So that's a little bit about, they're very much in tune with the YouTube, TikTok, etc. These are kiddos, I mean Gen Alpha too, but I have to say your phone goes on silent and put away during a session. Like you're getting calls, you're getting texts, is very distracting. They're very reliant on their phones. They are very socially aware. So they're very into social movements. They're very, what people might say, woke, right? They are interested in climate change, activism, equality, because they have grown up seeing the power of these movements. They value diversity, inclusion, and this is, of course, not everyone, but they try to be very inclusive. They oftentimes are the ones leading these conversations, right? Because I have so many kiddos tell me I'm worried about climate change because I'm worried for what's going to happen, right? They're engaging in these types of conversations. And schools have often started to have these conversations too about diversity, equity, inclusion as well. So we're going to quickly get into some of the more, let's call it boring stuff. I do want to preface this by saying, we have both social workers, counselors, marriage and family therapists here. Rachel and I are both social workers. So if we're talking about code of ethics from a social work lens, that's just because that's what we practice in. But if you are a counselor, marriage and family therapist, you have your own code of ethics. And please just, if when in doubt, always go to your profession's code of ethics, but they're very, very similar. So ethical work is ethical work, but the wording might be a little bit different. So just FYI, heads up there. What is informed consent? You need to get informed consent to treat anyone. You need to get informed consent. However, this is where it gets tricky. We'll talk about this in a little bit of who is signing here with minors. Every state is different. But informed consent is basically that people need to be informed about what you're going to do in treatment. And it has to be documented. Don't ever take verbal consent. That's not enough. It has to be documented. And they have to agree to be able to do this. It's an ongoing process. What does this mean? It means that you always have to be going over informed consent. You don't just say once you consented, okay, we're cool. You should be having these conversations about consent often throughout the process. I'm pretty sure you guys understand get consent. What do you cover in informed consent? Everyone's agency is going to be different. Everyone's forms are going to be different, but you should be talking about the risks and benefits, confidentiality. For working with kids, this is important. When do you break confidentiality? When do you have to tell a parent or guardian what was said in session? Threat of harm or abuse to self or others. If there's a safety concern you need to, or if it's something that you feel could put them in danger. And I very clearly tell parents that, and I tell kids that. You should be going over fees and payments, if there's any fees or payments. Telehealth. How many of you do work with families, teens, kids virtually? I do some of that. I have a specific, this is just me in private practice, I have a specific telehealth consent form just saying, not only do you consent to treatment with me, here's the risks and benefits of working with kiddos and parents virtually, right? Like make sure you're in a private space. We don't record unless I have consent to record, those type of things. And then boundaries. I know we don't talk about that much, but you should have some sort of policy of what are you going to do with social media? I don't accept anyone on social media, but I have a policy in my consent forms that says like, hey, they can look me up, right? I mean, it's public information, but I'm not going to accept clients on social media. I'm not going to talk to them on personal cell phone. I have a Google Voice number that I text on, those type of things. They can find us though. That's what I'm going to say. Like, you think you're private, Google yourself. That's what clients are going to do to you. They'll tell me, I looked you up on LinkedIn, right? So just know that we are findable. That just is what it is. Yes, Rachel says, Google yourself regularly just to make sure you see what's out there. Okay. I'm going to get through this quickly because we want to stay on time. So confidentiality with minors, check your jurisdiction. Every state has different rules and regulations about when a minor can consent to treatment. Some states is as young as 14, they can sign themselves and parents do not need to be involved. Some states it's 18. Check, I'm not going to give state statutes here because every state's wildly different, but check with your state to determine the laws around minors. However, I will say I'm a big advocate for children, teens having privacy. I've had some parents that say, I want to sit in every session. I said, that's not how I work, right? That might be better for like a family therapy session. Kids deserve the right to privacy just as an adult would deserve the right to privacy. But I will tell them, and Rachel's going to go into like what she will tell parents versus not tell parents. But you need to go over this in the first session so the kid knows and the parent knows, because you can get into, tell me every single thing that the kid said. What they say about me, I'm like, I'm not going to tell you that. Right? But it's important that you get confidentiality. There's parental consent, and then there's minor assent. So consent is getting the parent or legal guardian to sign forms. Generally, if they're under 18, they need to sign. And this means that they get to consent to their child being in treatment or not. And then what is assent? So parents sign, but what is assent? We want to make sure that there's some buy-in from the minor, right? So I will say, Mom and Dad signed the paperwork, but I want to know from you. Do you agree to be here, right? If they're like, no, I'm like, well, let's give it a few sessions try before we completely give up on it. Usually they come around, but we want to make sure that they understand what they're getting signed up for. I've had many parents that are like, my kid needs therapy, and I'm like, they're not bought in, so they're not going to make any progress here. Assent does not replace consent, but you should be telling the kiddo what's going to happen in appropriate ways as you go on throughout. Okay. When do you break confidentiality? 3 things that I break for: risk of harm. If they are self-harming at a level, we're going to talk about self-harm that I think is a safety concern. Any suicidal or homicidal thoughts that have a plan. We're going to talk more about that as well. And then threats of violence. And I don't mean I'm going to beat this person up. Like, we're talking about violence that would cause harm to someone else that raises to the level that we find a safety concern. This is where it's gray area. You have to use your clinical judgment. If they're being abused or neglected, we have to report, right? We are not investigators. We're just there to report. I mean, we're not the investigators. We're just there to report. And then legal requirements. Sometimes we get subpoena. We have to give over our documents if the court says so. I stay away from contentious divorces, but I've had to go to court and you have to testify sometimes. So it's rough. Here's an example of when I would break confidentiality. A 15-year-old discloses active suicidal intentions with a plan. So I want to end my life and my plan is to do it this way. I'm going to make a safety plan and parents are going to be on that safety plan. And I'm going to say very straightforward. I don't like to dance around it. I'm worried for your safety. Parents need to keep you safe. We need to keep you safe. I know you're going to be mad at me that I have to tell them, but my job's to keep you safe. So that's a time I would break confidentiality. Okay. Whew. I get to breathe now and sit back. Rachel's going to walk you through building rapport, and then she has a very interesting case study that we're going to talk about that touches on tons and tons and tons of different ethical pieces. So I'm going to kick it on over to Rachel.
Yeah. So as I said, I work with a ton of teen girls right now, but I feel like I go through phases. I don't know if anybody else gets this, where all of a sudden you have like 6, 8-year-old boys, or right now I have like 7 girls between the ages of like 12 and 18. And it for whatever reason, I feel like my caseload goes in waves. But so a couple of things I am talking more from a teen perspective, just because I do see younger kids, but I see a lot of teens right now, and adolescents. So one of the things that I do straight off the bat is I'm very upfront with teens. I tell them what confidentiality is. I tell them that what they say in the room stays with me unless someone is hurting them or they are hurting someone. And I'm very clear. I I I want them to know where the lines are. And I tell them too, I'll say, you know what, if something comes up that I think your parents need to know that maybe isn't per se a safety issue, I'm going to talk about that with you. We're going to talk about why mom and dad need to know this. We're going to talk about how we're going to go about this. And figure out what we want to do. But I am very clear about that. I I I don't care how young a child is. I usually go through some version of this in an age appropriate way. I usually see 6 and up, and I will be as open with them as I am with older kids, but just in a very age appropriate way. Um, I I'm very clear that when a safety issue comes up, that I'm going to tell them, like, okay, this is a safety issue. Like Megan said, I'm very open and like I'm going to be straightforward. Like, if it's a safety issue, I'm concerned for your safety. Therefore, we are bringing mom and dad in, or caregiver, or whoever it may be. We're bringing that person in, and your safety is the number one priority. And I will say that as well. Safety is our number one priority. If you're not safe, everything else we're doing is essentially moot. Like, it's not going to work. So I also say, like, before I talk to your parents, I'm going to check in with you, especially with teens. If I know I have a parent meeting coming up, I'll be very clear, like, hey, you know what? I'm talking to your mom and dad on Friday. Is there anything in particular that you really don't want me to say? Is there anything in particular that you think needs to be addressed? Just want to get their opinion, especially for teens, just so they have an idea of what is being said. I've even had kids help me write emails to their parents, because that made them feel more secure, in knowing what information was being sent out there. I've also had kids who have hacked their parents' emails and it has not turned out well. And so, one, always a good idea to double check with parents to make sure that their emails are confidential. But two, it's good for kids to know what's going in that email so they're not surprised by anything. Um, I frame process, not content. So what I mean by that is I'm going to tell your parents what we're doing in therapy, what we're working on. I'm not going to tell them everything you say. So you can come in here and say, my dad is being so unfair, or my mom is the most annoying person on earth. And I'm not going to tell them that. What I'm going to tell them is, we're working on anxiety. And today we talked about family stressors and how they can manage that. And you know what? Here are some ways you can also help them you can support them in these ways with their stressors. So I'm very clear about process, not content. And then I also usually will bring in a parent, if possible, my first like in-person interaction with a parent. I like my kid to be there. I want the client to see how that interaction goes, and I want them to know that whatever information I am giving them is the same information um as I gave the child. So and I'll even have kids like tell the parents like, okay, so we went over this. Can you tell them what stays in here, what I'll tell them, etc. And kids are fun. But there's sometimes some need to correct some things because they'll be like, she's not going to tell you anything ever. No, not what I said. So just, keeping in mind some of those things. But I find that kids are a lot more open with me off the bat if they feel like they have a sense of like what is being shared instead of that needing to like be learned along the way. There's an upfront conversation. Um, yeah, a lot of client empowerment, even from a young age. And I tell kids like, this is your therapy. Like, yeah, mom and dad might have brought you here, but this is your therapy, and I want it to be your therapy. Mom and dad are not in this room. I'm on your team, so let's make it yours. Um, uh, sorry, I lost uh, my controller. So some activities I use to build connection with kids. I love a thumb ball. You can get pre-made thumb balls. They're very cheap. You can get them off of Amazon or wherever.
And
But
Rachel, do you just want to quickly explain? It's very self-explanatory,
yeah,
but if people don't know exactly what it is,
yeah,
I should have put a picture of one, but
yeah, good point. So a thumb ball it's a little, it's a ball that has different questions on it usually, or I have one that's like a first experiences. So it'll be like your first vacation you remember or whatever. And you toss it back and forth, and wherever your thumbs land is the question you answer. So they're really fun. Some of the things will be like, pick your own question, or I had one that was an emotions one, that somebody stole. But it was really great because it not only like it would have emotions on they usually look like a soccer ball. So on one pattern of the ball, it had emotions listed, and you could just talk about like what that emotion was or have a kid explain that to you. And then on the other color pattern, it had questions regarding emotions, and emotion management. So the other thing I love to do though is make them myself. I will get just like a squishy soccer ball off of Amazon, and we'll make them together with uh, Sharpies or paint pens or whatever. So it's decorative, but it's also like they get to pick the questions. And you have to answer the questions too with teens, because then it's like you're building a relationship. They feel like they get to know you a little bit. I've had some really interesting ones. And I've had some pretty standard. I had one where a kid wrote out a question about like, um, tell your therapist has to talk about their first experience with betrayal. I was like, wow, all right, like that got real. fast. So they sometimes get a little intense, but they can be really fun. Um, Music, I love doing this with particularly teens because music is usually a really big part of their life. And so I'll have them make me a playlist about their life. And then they can either send it to me, we can listen to it together, we can talk about why those songs are there. Um, I one time had a kid take this to the nth degree and came up with a playlist for every year of their life starting in first grade. And it was a lot. I don't know if we actually got through any, like all of those playlists because there was just a lot of playlists. Um, Art, I will say to kids and teens, when I'm doing art with them, I will say, draw me a self-portrait, draw me a picture of your life, draw me a picture of your family, your social system. But the prompt I give, is using lines, shapes, and colors. So I'm not like, I'll say, like, if you want to draw me a stick figure as your self-portrait, I mean, go crazy. But if you want to like mimic Picasso, I don't, right? Like, I don't care. And so I'll talk to them about like different things. And I have a couple of examples that, like people have given me permission to use of like their self-portraits that are not, that do not risk confidentiality, but give a couple of different ideas of like what that might look like. Um, so that's usually really fun. You will be surprised at what you get when you open a prompt that wide, and yeah, it gets very real. Um, Creating a life timeline together. So this is one of my more favorite things to do. I have an entire pack of sticky notes that are like all different colors. And then I have a pack of like Sharpie pens that are also all different colors, and some of them are sparkly. It's great. And then we will sit down and we'll put the timeline on my wall as we do it. And so, for kids, I usually go by grade or by like big events. And so I find that like for kids, they usually need some prompts. But for older teens, like I've had them just like break it down for me themselves and just be like, and then this happened and this happened. It's really helpful. I find it really helpful for one, getting a bigger picture of their life and like how they view their life. But the other thing too, if you are dealing with a more complex case, it can be really helpful to just get the pieces out there, and kind of see what you're dealing with and what is happening. Um, Also, I mean, like you can take this to different levels. I had a kid who took her timeline home and then they turned it into a scrapbook. I was working with them on grief. And so we were doing a timeline of like their grief, and they took it home and they had lost quite a few people for their age. And they turned it into like a memorial scrapbook for the people they lost. And it was honestly one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Um, so it can be really cool to see like where they take things and how they move forward. I've also had them do like a future timeline, like where do you want to go? Like, okay, this is where we are. Where do you want to go? What does your future look like? What would you like to be on your future timeline? And get some ideas about what they're looking for. So yeah, there's some ideas.
Can I make a quick comment, Rachel? Because I have to give a sand tray push. So
Yeah.
Rachel knows I use sand tray. How many of you are familiar with sand tray? It's new to me since going to private practice, but if you're not familiar, definitely encourage you to take a sand tray training. They're wonderful. I have a sand tray, and how I sometimes engage teens is I have a whole what do you call it? Armoire, we'll call it, figurines, and the figures are their symbols. So I will say pick something that represents how you're feeling today, and they might pick Spider-Man, and then I can ask questions, or they might pick a flower. Like, it doesn't even need to be a living thing, but then they can, and this is good for kids that don't want to talk but they want to build. So sand tray is a great way to, if you get those kids that are just not really wanting to talk, utilize the tools that you have.
Yeah, I've actually in the case that I'm going to talk to you all about, that's a lot of fun. She was older, she's a teenager, and I actually did sand tray with her a couple of times because we'll talk about that more, but it was really helpful even for a teenager who was having a lot of trouble talking through their life. Gave us a lot of information really quick.
And the
Um,
sand, just one last point about the sand. It's a sensory experience. So stuff comes up that they're just like, whoa, like they're burying things and like without even like knowing. So there's some unconscious stuff there too. So it's a good sensory activity too.
yes, great sensory activity. Um, oh yeah. Kids and teens can spot fake. They just can. Megan mentioned earlier being called a boomer. I'm gonna tell you right now that is not a compliment. Um, they don't actually know what it means, I don't think, as far as generational pieces go, but it is not, they will let you know. Um, I will have kids like teach me things. I've had kids, show me TikToks. I've had them show me YouTube videos or, where they got some information or what they and their friends are doing, or like where they learned a specific thing. Because there's no way I can keep up with every single child's social media. But I can get them to teach me some things along the way. And I have been referred to as chuggy. I don't know if you guys have heard that term, but it was more a Gen Z term of like cringy, I guess. Um, but yeah, so chuggy was also a fun one. I had to learn that after being called that. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's not a compliment. It was not. But they can spot it really, really quickly. And so, not like, don't lie to them, don't pretend. They know, they are on top of it, and they will see that, and that will definitely damage connection. I've seen it happen. So, those are some ideas. So, I'm going to talk about my case now. So I picked this case for a couple of reasons. One, it covers a lot of ethical ground. And two, as we talked about, ethics can be a little dry sometimes. And this is anything but a dry case. So um gonna we're gonna go through it. So my client was a 13-year-old female. She was the oldest child. Her younger siblings were twins. They were 16 months younger than her. Her family identified as Christian. She grew up all over the world. She lived in many different countries. Her family finally settled in DC when she was 11, 12, and her parents had a pretty fraught relationship. They would never have gotten divorced. That was off the table, but there was a lot of fighting. So after a massive fight, her dad just left, didn't tell anybody where he was going, and he left and actually moved across the country to be with his family, but nobody knew this. But she then snuck out of the house that same night and she went to a college party, and she was raped at that party. From after that, like she started really doing some sexually risky behavior. And she was raped a second time at another party, um, like a couple of weeks later. There was not a lot of time in between. She also had started taking drugs, and just really like some really rough behavior, and generally not the kind of behavior that you think of when you think of a 13-year-old. Like it was very it was pretty intense and beyond her years. So she was then admitted to a facility after disclosing the rape at the college party. And she was there for 4 months. I believe it was 4 months. And then she was recommended for outpatient therapy for her transition home. I have completing her residential treatment in quotation marks because her parents did not tell me this until I had been working with her for a year, that they had actually signed her out AMA and had convinced the psychiatrist to sign off on the paperwork saying that she had completed her therapy, which she had not. So that was a fun thing to learn so late in the game. Um, her mom wanted to be present for every session in the entirety of every session. I saw her twice a week. She was coming from a facility, so I usually see those kids more regularly. But her mom wanted to be in everything. And so there was a lot of work that I had to do to let mom or allow for mom to allow us to have one-on-one individual therapy sessions. It took a lot of rapport with mom. I had to build rapport with mom. And that was honestly, I think, maybe even harder than the kid. But one of the things that happened in building rapport with the mother and also putting in some boundaries where I said, I'm going to see her individually for our first session, and then you can come in and be a part of the second half of our second session every week, really shifted my relationship with the client because it was the first time that her mom was not dictating her therapy. And so she started to open up more. Mom also, like, amazingly, after, I mean, it was a rough little bit, but she also got on board with that and was able to utilize that second half of the session really well instead of, monopolizing everything. She was fun. Building rapport with her was also just with the entire family was really difficult. And everybody had an opinion on how therapy should be, mom, dad, and client. And so managing that was, yeah, it was very interesting. And there was a lot of boundary setting. I think we paused there on this.
Rachel, I have just some things to ask. So for everyone watching, you might have a lot of questions about this. So any questions that you're like, whoa, Rachel, this is hard. How did you deal with that? Put those in the chat. We would love to pick Rachel's brain. Me and her obviously met before this to talk about this. I'm still thinking about how she had the expertise to deal with this case because it's a really hard one. So if you're just like wondering, like, whoa, how did you deal with risky behavior and this and that? Please put it in the chat. We'll have time to debrief this a little bit more because this is one of those cases. I mean, all of you have probably had some that sticks with you. It just sticks with you in your career. So go ahead, put any questions you have in the chat for Rachel about this case, and we're gonna weave the case. You'll hear more about this case throughout.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to this case multiple times. But yes, please feel free to drop your questions. So little segue. I'm going to talk about disclosure. So there are many different perspectives on disclosure. I come from a harm reduction perspective. That's how I was taught. And so if there's not necessarily suicidal ideation, depending on, what the threat level is, I'm not necessarily going to disclose self-harm to a parent. That is I think that's very much dependent on, clinician comfortability. I have worked with suicidal ideation and self-harm in teenagers for a really long time. And so not that I always get it right, but I feel like I have a little bit of a spidey sense when it comes to like, okay, this is more than what I'm being told in this moment. I also, when I'm thinking through harm reduction, I'm also thinking about parental response. So different case, I had a kid who had been self-harming, family knew, she had been doing great. We had a little slip up. She self-harmed again. She told me immediately. I did not tell her mom. I did not tell her parents because I knew that that was actually going to just set us back in every direction for every single person in the family. And I was not worried about it happening again, just based on how she had gone about it and what she had talked to me about. And we re-upped her safety plan, all that good stuff. when it comes to child self-disclosure, I almost always utilize child self-disclosure if I can. So if we do need to tell the parents, I ask kids, do you do you want me to talk to your parents? Do you want to talk to your parents with me? And I will even give them the option. I'll grab mom and dad or whoever's here. They can come in and talk to you, and I'll step out of the room for a couple of minutes if you don't want me present. I've had kids use every single one of those options. Most of the time, they ask if I can tell their parents with them in the room. Fine, totally fine. We can do that. But I really want them to be a part, excuse me, I really want them to be a part of that process if they can be. And I'm very open about some of those things. Um, so one of the other things is workplace policies. You will have very different workplace policies on disclosure. So Megan has worked in schools, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in schools, if somebody is self-harming, that is a disclosure. It does not, there's
Yeah.
not a lot of nuance there. Um,
I worked in schools. So my background, I worked in schools for nearly 10 years, public schools, and there were certain things we had to report. And you'd have to make like an incident report. So if you work in schools, that's very different than if you work in private practice. I know some of you on this call also are working in hospitals, so disclosure there is different. Sometimes like what we want to do does the self-disclosure pieces, we have to also follow agency policy. So I will just tie this back to what I talked about, confidentiality in the beginning. Also let clients and parents know what your workplace policies are. So I had to tell kiddos like, sometimes like, because I work in a school, I have to tell certain things. So just make sure you also know your workplace policies too, because that might be very different than if you're in private practice. So thank you, Rachel.
yes, there's a lot of variance. Um, so, and the other thing, and we kind of touched on this earlier, different state laws regarding abuse and reporting abuse. Those are very, very different, depending on where you live. And as Megan said, right, like some places consent for treatment is 14, and the same goes for the consent, right? So especially if it's not a caregiver who has abused, it might be that if the client is 14, they can choose not to file a criminal complaint. And then that just is what it is because they are of that age. Um,
Also, reporting laws, Rachel will give an example in her case, but reporting laws, always report. We don't know if they'll take it or not, but you might get different responses based on the state as well.
yeah. Yeah. And I will talk about that more, but two quick things just to note: always report and always take down the name of the person you reported to. Because if anything comes back to you, you want to be able to say, like, here's where I reported, this is when I reported, this is who I gave it to, and this is what I was told. It's definitely a CYA, but better safe than sorry in all of those. So
Document. I have had cases where I'm sure some of you in schools, we've had to report nearly daily for neglect and abuse, and it was not rising to getting any sort of like level. But then it got to be very, it got to the point where we now had a record. I have called CFSA every single day for 2 weeks, and I've talked to this person and this person and this person, because it did get to a point then there was like legal ramifications and stuff. So always, always, always document.
yes, yeah. Documentation is your best friend in these situations. Highly recommend it. So rupture and repair. When there's a disclosure, take time to repair. Even if teens say they're over it, give them space, talk through it. I ask them, how could we do this differently in the future? Knock on wood, we don't have to, but let's say it happens again. What do we do? And I apologize. I am not afraid to apologize to my kids and my teens. I think it's important. And so I just acknowledge, like, I know that your confidence was broken here, and I know that, maybe what came out of this was not what you wanted. Um, and we had to do what we had to do, but I also understand that the impact of this is significant. Um, I will, I think this is, yeah, I like to utilize the therapeutic apology. This is from emotion focused family therapy. Adele LaFrance is the author of the book that I took this from, which is called What to Say to Kids When Nothing Seems to Work. And there's also a handout that we'll give you at the end that has more information on this. I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So the therapeutic apology looks like directly naming. So I want to talk to you about when I had to call CPS because, your mom and dad had hurt you, or when I had to tell your parents that you were cutting, or fill in the blank, and how hard that must have been for you, especially because I broke your confidence because you thought this was a safe place and then it wasn't. Um, Whatever, fill in the blank. I know that your trust was compromised. Um, and then label and validate the painful emotions and experiences associated with the event. Validate at least 3 emotions or emotional experiences. So you might not have 3 emotions. I put two down here, but I do 3 becauses. So I can imagine that you felt really angry because I broke your trust, because something that was really important to you, or because something that you thought was safe in here wasn't. Because you now have to go to a higher level of care, or whatever it may be. I say, maybe hurt, maybe angry, frustrated, whatever emotion you see popping up in those moments, I can imagine, or I'll even say, like, man, it seems like you're really angry. Makes total sense because. I also teach parents the therapeutic apology very frequently, because they need it. I also use it on parents, quite often as well, because they also need that validation, especially if you do have to call CPS, or if you do have to do something that they feel ruptures that relationship. So yeah, you will get more information on this in the handouts, but it's a great starting place. Um, for kids too, they are going to correct you. If you're like, I imagine you feel angry, and they're not angry, they're going to be like, no, I don't feel angry. I feel X, Y, or Z. Or like I've had kids like, I don't know what I feel. And I've given them an emotions wheel, and then they said, now I feel angry. Fair. And we talk about that. But they will tell you if you're off. And if you list a because that does not resonate with them, if you're like, yeah, you're angry because I broke your confidence, and they're like, no, I'm angry because my mom told me I shouldn't be telling you these things because she doesn't want to get in trouble. Oh, all right, well,
Or I'm
now
angry because now I'm grounded and don't have cell phone use because I'm in trouble. I've had that. No, I'm
Mhm.
not angry at you. I'm pissed off because I don't have my cell phone now for a week.
Yeah, yep, yeah. You will also very frequently get, I'm never telling you anything ever again. All right, that's fair. I will spend time being like, yeah, I get that. Like, it's going to take time for me to rebuild your trust. It's going to take time for us to get back to where we were. I'm not expecting for that to happen overnight. I think that will take some time. Um, and they will, if you do get them in trouble, i.e., grounded, things of such, they will let you know. Um, and that's okay. So, uh, yeah, this is fun. Sometimes they'll hate this, but most of the time I've had kids respond really well to the therapeutic apology. Um, like I even had a kid who like literally was sitting their back to me, and I started using the therapeutic apology, and by the end of the session they were turned around and talking to me and crying. Doesn't always go that way, but I have had a lot of good success with it. So I recommend learning it and utilizing it. Um, Case example part 2. Um, so back to my client. She came home, she continued to act out sexually and have some other behaviors that were not great. She ended up having sex with a man in his 30s when she was 14. He was a delivery driver, and she told him that if he went and got her alcohol, she would have sex with him, which he did, and which he did. She taped the incident, but refused to identify the man. No charges were ever filed, and CPS and the state wouldn't even take the report because she was 14. So I called CPS. I talked to them. Like, this happened, and they said, well, this is a criminal complaint because she was not harmed by a caregiver, so you need to call the police. Took down name, documented, and then I had to, of course, tell her parents, which she did not like, but had to bring her parents in. I mean, also at this point, like, I mean, we are dealing with so many things here. We are dealing with statutory rape. We're dealing with child pornography, technically. We are dealing with potential STDs, STIs. We don't know what's going on there. Lots going on. She also then distributed the tape of her having sex to a few friends, who then distributed it to the entire high school that she was in. So then we also had distributing of child pornography as well. There's lots going on. But so she started cutting after this and talking about suicide because she was kicked out of school for obvious reasons. And she was really angry at me that I had to talk to her parents about this. She was really angry about every piece of it. And part of why she refused to file was that she was mad and stubborn. So, she also tried to tell us that the reason why she wouldn't file was because she told the man that she was 18. This kid does not look 18. Like, this kid was a very young looking 14-year-old. Like, she did not look anywhere close to 18. That was not a part of, yeah, it was a whole thing. Yes, the man knew she was a child. He was very aware. So this is where we are. This is where we're at. This kid needs a higher level of care, in my opinion, right? Like, we are talking out of control. We are talking severe risk to herself and to others at this point as well. And she's also a severe risk to her siblings, who are not that much younger than her. And she's not doing so well. But her parents were determined that she was not going back to a higher level of care. They were like, we will never do that again to our child. We feel like we abandoned her. We're not going to do that. This is when it came out that they had signed her out AMA from her last residential. So, I mean, I would love if people to throw some things in the chat. What do you do when a child is at severe risk to themselves and the parent is not willing to work with you, not willing to look into a higher level of care?
I'm wondering, Rachel, if you have feelings coming up about this, everyone, this is a tough, tough case. So I'm feeling all sorts of things. This is when we're having counter transference, right? I'm wondering, at what point do we then report to CPS for parents not being able to keep her safe?
Yeah, that was a very big question, right? Like, at what point in time, do I need to report them? I actually called CPS at one point and asked them, like, can I report the parents for this? And they would not take that report either, because they said technically there was no proof of abuse or neglect.
And all we can do is report and document.
Yeah. So again, report, document. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good point. Like, this is a tough case, and this case had a lot of different examples of just everything seemed to go wrong always with this case. By the end of working with her, I could set my clock. Like, I knew that every 4 to 6 weeks we were due for another big blow up of some sort.
I have a question, Rachel. What was your working diagnosis at this point? Clinically.
So she had been diagnosed from the residential. She had been diagnosed with potential borderline, which I was like, they can't diagnose it based on her age. So that was kind of like that's where she came in at. My diagnosis had been a developmental trauma just with the moving and then learning about the parents and their contentious relationship and how much she had witnessed of that. And then I also found out later that when her mom was pregnant with her siblings, when she was under the age of 2, under the age of 1.5, her mom was put on bed rest for 7 of the 9 months and was not able to pick her up or hold her. And so, and her dad was not a holding type of person. And so there had been a lot of ruptures within attachment. Yeah, huge piece. So I mean, technically, I couldn't diagnose an attachment disorder because there's not an F code for that. But I used PTSD and an adjustment disorder as my adjustment disorder with disturbance of mood and conduct is what I used. So, yeah, there was a lot of neglect early on. So, um, yeah. So, okay. Let me look here. I think all right. So really quickly before I know we're about ready for a break, really quickly for parent and caregiver repair. So the parents were understandably upset about this, but I did disclose it right away. So they were upset about all of it, and they were also upset about like, well, why isn't therapy working, et cetera, et cetera. We had to have a lot of family meetings and talk through a lot of that. Um, I've had parents get angry at me for not disclosing something that they wanted to know that was not disclosable. And that happened in this case too. Like there were things that happened with this kid that were not disclosable. They were just normal high school things, normal teenage things. And, mom got really upset because she thought she should know every little detail. And so, we had to have a lot of those conversations. I had to reiterate, like, this is confidentiality. This is the contract that we all agreed to in the beginning. And if your kid is at risk, if your child has a safety issue, you are going to know right away. I am not compromising on their safety. Um, but some of these things are not safety issues. Some of these things you just want to know, which is fair. Like, of course you want to know. I hear you. And they're not disclosable. And so I'll go through like what is and is not disclosable with parents more than one time if I need to. And I will set up a separate time with them. I've had parents come in and be like, okay, but is this disclosable? What is disclosable? What about this? What about that? And I'll go through it with them, like listen to their questions and go through it piece by piece. And then just reiterating the boundaries. Some parents can have a really hard time with boundaries with their child's therapist. And so reiterating and maintaining those boundaries really is really critical, but it also is a really good modeling for everyone involved. I think it's good modeling for the child. I think it's good modeling for the parents, that these are our boundaries and this is what we're sticking to. Mhm. Um, CPS reporting. When CPS report is involved, I say be as transparent as you are comfortable. Again, different states have different laws about this. Some states say it is illegal for you to tell the family because you could be compromising the investigation. So really, I think it's clinician based. I think it's safety based, and I think it's state based. Um, if I am talking to the parents about it, I remind them it's not your job to substantiate anything. You just have to make the report because it was told to you. That's why you have to say it. We often believe no repair can happen after a CPS report. And yes, that is true in many cases. But I think that there's also space where you can utilize the therapeutic apology with parents and see if you can rebuild some of that trust, and see if you can actually have a relationship repair. Um, I think that a lot of times this can be a very foundational and first experience with relationship repair for a lot of people. And so if done well, I think that there's so much that can be gained from that. honestly, some of the best parents I've ended up working with were parents that I did have to report at one point in time, and it sucked and it was horrible. And we actually built a really powerful relationship out of that, and a different level of trust, etc. So I my point there is just don't throw it all away. Um, like critically think about whether or not a repair is possible or if a repair is appropriate for the situation. Um, I think, and I think that leads us up to break time.
Perfect. So we're gonna take a break here in just a moment, but this is a good time. This is some heavy stuff. It's a tough case, but I think it's a very good one because there's about 20 different ethical ways we could go this and legal. So take some time. Also, I just want to talk about CPS. That depends on your setting too. Some settings will say you have to like report or you have to do it with the supervisor. When I worked in a school, there was many times I did not disclose to the parents because it was a safety, like my safety could be in jeopardy. And the parents will ask you, are you the one that reported? And I would just say everyone is a mandated reporter. I did not feel comfortable saying it was me. But I said, I can't, that is confidential information. I cannot confirm or deny who reported. That's just how I handled it. So yeah, it depends on where you're at. And someone said, like supervision is so important and discussion. We're going to talk at the end about like, what do you do when these type of things come up? We're just kind of setting the groundwork, but then we're going to, at the end, talk through like, yikes, I'm stuck here. I don't know what to do. This is scary. And I will say the very first time I reported to CPS, I was so anxious. I was like, I don't want to do it. I feel like this is so hard. So if you need someone to like, if you have a supervisor, someone that can sit with you to do it. And sadly, like I had to do it. I've done it many, many times now, but it's hard.
I would
It's
just
hard.
like to throw on there that the first time I had to call CPS, I threw up.
Yeah, it's not, it doesn't,
It's not a
it doesn't feel good, but it's part of the job. So we will have time for these questions at the end. So I have 23 after the hour here. Let's come back at 33 after. So take a break. We will come back in 10 minutes. Thanks. I'm going to turn off my camera so you're not just seeing a blank screen, but we will be back here in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Okay, we're going to come back together and go ahead and get into part 2. I know it's heavy stuff and it's flying by. We really could make this like a multi-day training, but this is kind of the condensed everything you need to know ethics wise. And I forgot to mention, we have an Agents of Change helper here. So Bonnie Solis is going to be your point of contact. If you have any logistical stuff like, hey, I got kicked out, message Bonnie and she will help you, or she will figure out the right person to help you with that. So any logistical stuff you have there, Bonnie is your person. So thanks, Bonnie. And Rachel's gonna jump right back in to levels of care. And okay, so she's just her and I both currently work in outpatient, but sometimes outpatient is not cutting it. So we're gonna kick it off and have Rachel start with that.
Yeah, so higher levels of care. So this, I love this graph, but it is missing residential. So generally I look at it as outpatient, IOP, PHP, residential, inpatient hospitalization. So I've put more explanations on other slides. So not that I mean to go super deep into any of these, but outpatient, obviously, weekly or biweekly therapy, IOP, typically several times a week. In the evenings, several hours. There's usually a family component. If there's not a family component for an IOP for a kid or a teen, I would strongly recommend you look for a different IOP, because that's a really huge, important part of it. And they don't always have them. A lot on this slide. Partial hospitalization, typically held Monday through Friday for an entire school day. Um, Families should be included again in some aspect. There's a lot of different PHPs that can be part of hospitals. They can be charter school based. They can be their own thing completely. So there's a lot of options. Residential treatment, a specialized form, 24-hour supervision. They're living there. It's non-hospital usually. Sometimes they are connected to a hospital, but usually non-hospital. And it's a very intensive therapeutic environment. Inpatient hospitalization, 24-hour program for stabilization and acute mental health crisis needs. Typical stay, this says 7 to 10 days, but I would say typical stay is more like 3. I feel like they move people out of there really quickly. So I have had a couple of clients actually do the entire step. So think of one client who I had to have her hospitalized for suicidal ideation. And then she went straight to residential from her inpatient stay, and she was in residential for 6 months. And then she stepped down to PHP, and then she stepped down, I think 3 months later, she stepped down to IOP. And then 3 months after that, she came back for outpatient. And I actually brought her back. That's not always the case, which I will talk about a little bit more later. But in that case, that particular client came back. The client who I have been talking about also went through many of these forms, but quickly we learned around the PHP level that like she was probably not going to ever leave residential care. So, and even if she had stepped all the way down, I don't think I would not have had her come back to me. But that is clinician discretion, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So there's also a couple other pieces here that I want to talk about really quickly. Depending on money really determines where someone can get care. If somebody is really insurance based and that's the only way they're going to get care, it actually is like that can mean we're looking at months long delays. We're potentially looking at not great options for that particular person. There's just a lot of barriers, I would say, particularly if you don't have access to resources to pay for some of these things. And some of these treatment programs are the cost of college. Like they're not cheap. They're not, especially if they're a private based and they don't take insurance. I had a client who came to me after doing 6 months of residential, and he had spent over 120 grand on 6 months of residential. So, it can be incredibly expensive and therefore will not work. The other, I think, thinking about like IOP versus DBT. So DBT is its own special thing, but it does usually include a group component. For teens, it should always include a parent component and individual therapy sessions. So generally speaking, if you're seeing a kid and they need to go to DBT, they should be seeing their DBT therapist or being in group 3 times a week. They should be having 3 therapeutic interventions a week, more or less. So some will do more, but a lot of times I think for DBT, people forget to include parents. And I would say that a lot of times kids who need DBT have parents who also could really benefit from DBT. So if they're not doing that, I encourage people to continue to look and see what else is out there. One of the nice things about DBT treatment is a lot of times it is covered by insurance because it's an evidence-based model. And so it can sometimes be the better option versus IOP if you can't, one, get into an IOP, or if the IOP is not conducive for that kid, I will sometimes look at DBT treatment instead. Not always, sometimes. Um, Partial hospitalization, though, is I do not look at DBT as a replacement for PHP. PHP is just a more intensive treatment base. And so I think that it's important to look at what you have open, look at the options and quality of program, and then decide where you want to send your client. Um, which can be really, again, really, really tricky. Um, yeah, DBT should always include a parent for kids. It does not. I highly disagree with people who are doing DBT for kids without including parents. There's no accountability outside of the therapy room. It's not going to work. That's the long and short of it. um, the other the other piece here with higher levels of care um, is determining if a client should return to you after. So as I said, I've had a client who came back to me, and that has worked wonderfully. It's been a great therapeutic relationship. We did have to do some repair because I was the person who had to have her hospitalized, and I was the person who also said she had to go through all of this other treatment. um, and she did great, and she really worked the program, and a year and a few months later she came back to me. um that was a kid that I was willing to take back. Really good support system in her family. She also had worked really hard. She wanted to get better. um and so bringing her back on board for therapy was completely appropriate, and I felt 100% comfortable doing that. I have had other clients that I would never bring back on in a million years, either for safety reasons, my own safety, their safety, or just inappropriate level of care. Like I've worked with many clients, as I'm sure many of you have, who will not ever go down to outpatient therapy. That will never ever be enough. Um, so I think that determining, right, like you never have to take a client back. I think that's something that should be voiced, is that you don't have to take your clients back after a higher level of care. You get to decide if it's appropriate. You get to decide if it's a good fit. Um, and then you can say yay or nay. I've had families where I've just said, like, I'm really sorry, but I'm completely full now, and I cannot work them in as often as they need to be seen. So here is a list of recommendations. Um, and then the family runs with it. But I do think that it's important to have those conversations too, like letting people know. If you like, I've had people who just expected their kid was going to come back to me. No. I've had people who were like, why did the hospital call you? Well, probably because I was the person who referred them there. And so just like being really open and communicative about that process, I think is really important. Um, Particularly as parents have their own expectations and their own ideals. And so I think being transparent with them about the process is really important. Um, you can also just like Google like higher level of care, and it will give you like all the different things. And then I've actually used some of those things to then talk to families about like what we're looking at trajectory wise. Obviously depending on what's going on. So for the case I've been talking about, inpatient hospitalization had to happen. Unfortunately, some other things happened along the way. Um, but I was very clear with the family that like I did not think we were ever going to get to a place where she would be appropriate for or for outpatient services. Um, and that was a really hard conversation. But I was honest about that. I figured they needed to know that, needed to know where our goal was. Um, oh no. Oh, there we go. Okay.
I just wanted to quickly add, sometimes when you refer a client to IOP or they begin an IOP, they cannot have contact with their therapist. I had someone go and her care had to be fully transferred to the IOP, and I could check in with the parents and see how things were going, but I could not see the client for therapeutic services. In that case, IOP will usually, before they graduate them from a program, the parent will have to have some sort of plan for who they're going to see after. So the plan for this client that I'm thinking of was to see me. So I started to see her after. But then I don't do DBT. We realized she really still needed DBT. So she came to me for a short time, and then we were able to refer her out to DBT. So sometimes it might not be appropriate based on what modalities you use, or what is working for them and what's not working for them.
Yeah. And the same is true for a DBT program. DBT does not allow outside therapists usually. I worked as a DBT therapist in like a program to Fidelity for about 1.5 years. So I have been able to see some of my clients in a DBT program just because they know that I know what they're doing. And so if they like want to continue some sort of support, I'll see them like maybe every other week or once a month or something just to continue that relationship. But not very often. So, and DBT, somebody was talking in the chat about doing DBT. DBT is very specific. So there's a reason why they don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, with too many recipes. So
Rachel,
yeah.
we're not going to get super into this, but do you want to just give the tie the loose end of what happened with this client you were presenting on?
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about this real quick. So clearly we needed a higher level of care. She went to an inpatient facility. They released her to her parents, and I told the parents that unless they followed through on the recommendation, I would not continue to see her. At the time, this is like post-pandemic kind of, and so demand was very high for residentials, and she could not get into one for like 6 months. We did eventually, I actually was very proud of myself because I convinced her to go, like she willingly signed up for a residential. I was very proud of myself for that one. But because it took so long to get her in, she ran away, she got pregnant, she had an abortion, she attempted an assault on her siblings. There was a lot of drug and alcohol use. And when she ran away, she was gone for like quite a few days. They found her in a park roaming the streets. She also then, once she was then put in an inpatient hospital, awaiting her residential stay because she was not safe at home. At that time, she also, I think she attempted suicide in the inpatient. It was not a very serious attempt. She was fine, but she was put on a pretty intense surveillance. At this point in time, she was 14 years old. Just throwing that out there. She was not very old. And she also attacked her mom at one point. And it was just a really rough few months. She did end up getting into a residential treatment center, and she was promptly kicked out because she kept flashing the male attendings, and trying to trade sex for other things with them. And then she was eventually transferred to a high intensity treatment center for all girls with only female staff. And she is not allowed to come home. Her parents were devastated by that. And we actually had to do, we still had to do a lot of, work with me and the parents around like insurance and what I had to say in order for her to get the care she needed. And I told the parents, like, I have to be very candid in these letters to the insurance company. You are signing off on them. You are saying I can write them. I have the release, but I have to be very candid in them in order for her to get the treatment she needs. And that was really hard for the parents. It was really, really hard. But it worked out, and it was a lot of work, like getting her into a residential and getting insurance to pay for the high intensity treatment was a lot. And it was expensive. I remember at one point in time, her parents telling me they didn't want to send her to residential because they would have to use her college fund. And I flat out said to them, I said, you're not going to need a college fund. I said, either you send her to residential or she's dead. Like that is what we're looking at this point. Like she was taking who knows what. She was on the streets half the time. And it's like, you can save her college fund if you want, but she's not going to live to use it if we don't do something now. Um, and I was I was very candid with them about that. I was not, at that point in time, I was not beating around the bush anymore. Like we're not, like I'm going to be as direct as humanly possible. Um, so no, we're running out of time. So I'm gonna wrap up real quick. Um, so she is also not allowed to have any contact with her siblings until they are 18 and they can make that decision. And she will be probably in and out of treatment facilities for the rest of her life. She will not, like, she's not able to come home. She's not able to live on her own. She has very limited contact with her parents. Um, and so it's not a happy ending, right? Like, this is not a case with a happy ending. Um, but uh it it's real. It's real life. This is what happens sometimes, unfortunately. And yes, she was not allowed to return home for her safety and for her siblings' safety. Both. So, well, thank you all for walking through this incredibly intense case with me. I know it's a lot of information and it's an intense one. So,
Yeah. So we wanted to weave that through. You will get I hope you will get very few cases like this in your career, but they do come up. And I like that Rachel finished this with there's not a happy ending, but there's a safe ending. This client is where they need to be right now to be safe. It's not, oh, she was reunited with family and it's great. It's she's where she needs to be for safety. So it was from start to end, how long did you work with the client, Rachel?
a year and a half.
So this all happened in, I mean, a year and a half is a long time, but it's also for all of this to happen a short amount of time. So there's a lot to unpack in this
Yeah.
one.
She definitely gave me some gray hair. I remember pulling out a hair one time and I could see like where it was gray and then brown and gray and then brown. And I was like, oh, this is when this happened. And then we were good. And then when this happened. So it took a toll. I think too, also like sometimes and not always, but like in this case, based on her drug and alcohol abuse at such a young age and everything that had happened and everything she was going through, I remember after she was at the long-term treatment facility, one of the medical doctors saying to me, like, she will never mature to the point of being able to take care of herself. That is not going to happen. There's too much damage physically done to her system for
Yeah.
her to grow up. Um, and that was really hard to hear. Like that was so hard for me to hear, but I also knew she was safe and she was in a place where she was safe and taken care of. And at the end of the day, that was the best we could do. That's what we needed.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We'll have time at the end. There's lots of questions for Rachel and I to sift through. Let's keep them coming. There's good questions here. So we're not going to go through this just for time's sake, but if you should assess for safety, how many of you are familiar with any of these? PHQ-9, Columbia Suicide Rating, Beck Depression, and the SCARED. They are tools in your toolbox. We're not going to go through them to tell you how to administer them. But
They
we
are in
will,
the handouts.
yes, they are in your resources. So use them. They will all be listed for you in the resources that you get afterwards. You might have even seen the PHQ-9. My doctor now gives it to me every time I go. So it's like a very quick screener, very widely used. If you're not familiar with these, get yourself familiar with a safety screener that you have in your toolbox because you should be screening for safety at some point. I will also say with screeners, parents sometimes like to see like hard evidence like this. I'm like, they are here on the screener and they're like, oh, okay. Like they are very data based and research based. So I like to do it for some of those parents that like hard data. I'm like, hey, let's do this screener. Okay, wow, they're in the 99th percentile for this. And sometimes they're like, oh, now I get it. So we're not going to go through these, but they are tools for you to utilize. You should be doing some sort of safety screener if you are worried about safety of a client. Okay. We're going to switch gears now to talk about self-harm, suicidal ideation, safety contracts. What do we do? How many of you have worked with clients? I've had children as young as 4 have intrusive thoughts, but how many of you work with clients that intrusive thoughts are a big presenting symptom? I'm sure all of you, right? Intrusive thoughts, what are these? We all experience them. So this is not just kids and people that come to treatment. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. These are unwanted, involuntary thoughts, images, ideas that come into our mind without warning. We all have them. And we know that there's some stat that like 100 thoughts per minute come in and out of your mind. So we have them, but sometimes what the intrusive thoughts are about, depending on also the age of a child, they can be really troubling. Rachel works with OCD. OCD intrusive thoughts can be very, very, very scary for people, and it can actually then lead to compulsions that leads to like a whole variety of things. They are very for little kids, they'll sometimes, I'll give you an example because I work with the little ones, so I'm trying to think, like I might have an 8-year-old that says, I'm worried that I'm going to hurt my family member, and that will be very specific. They don't want to do that, but their brain is having a thought that, what if I took out a sharp object and hurt someone? So these can be scary. And I will say, we're going to kind of get into this when we're talking about self-harm, suicidalization, intrusive thoughts. Parents get very, very, very worried. And it's good when parents are worried. We want parents to have a level of concern, but a lot of this that we're talking about is going to have to be psychoeducation with the parents of what's an intrusive thought, what is a suicidal ideation, what's a suicidal intent, lots of different things. What do you do if a kiddo or teen or minor is experiencing intrusive thoughts? Validate, right? Like, you don't want to say, no, you're not having that. Yes, this is what an intrusive thought is. Have empathy for it. It's very scary that you have this, and reassure them that this is like a normal thing. And we're going to get some tools to help them when these thoughts become overwhelming. So you don't want to just say, tell me every detail of this intrusive thought. Some of them may have never out loud said it. I had a client that has been having intrusive thoughts for a year, and it took us a year for her to actually describe to me the level of intrusive thoughts because there was a lot of shame. I don't even want to say it out loud to my therapist. It's so embarrassing, right? It was sexual in nature. Make sure that you have built that therapeutic relationship where it is a safe space for your clients. And then this is huge. You want to make sure that it's a differentiation from psychotic symptoms, right? That this is not a delusion. This is not, and it's very hard. I will say childhood psychosis happens, but it's incredibly rare. It might be trauma or it might be something else, but it is very, very, very rare. If this happens, though, make sure they're seeing a psychiatrist, get them into a professional. You want to make sure there's a multidisciplinary team if you are suspecting some sort of psychotic symptoms or features. Okay, now this is the trigger warning. We're going to talk about self-harm. What is it? Self-harm, there's a definition here. Harming oneself intentionally by self-injury or self-poisoning, that's the term. Suicidal behavior is not the same as self-harm. It's plans or attempts to end one's own life. I like to separate that out. They can happen separately or they can happen together. I have so many parents that think my child is self-harming, so they're suicidal. And I have to say those are separate things because your particular child is not having suicidal intentions. They are self-harming. That's what this means, but your child specifically does not have suicidal ideations. Some of my clients have both. They're self-harming and they have suicidal ideations. So you have to be really mindful of what's going on there. And is it self-harm solo? Is it self-harm with suicidal ideations or homicidal ideations and that type of stuff? This is from a play therapy article that just came out. They're trying to measure self-harm amongst little ones. There's the common types. You've probably heard of cutting, right? This might be using a sharp object, razors, knives, scissors, and it's breaking the skin. When children, I will just preface this, when a child or adolescent tells me they're self-harming, I will ask questions of like, how deep is it? Does it draw blood? These are very awkward questions, but I need to know the severity. Like, is it breaking the skin? Where is the placement? I've had some kids that are near veins and stuff that can cause a lot of bleeding. And we have to remember developmentally where a kid's at, they're not probably thinking I'm near a vein when I'm cutting or how deep they're going. Some are, but these are like the things we need to know to determine safety. So there's cutting, burning. This could be cigarettes. This could be lighters, candles. I've had some kids using candles to use it, but heat to give some sort of burn. Scratching, to what I have seen, is more common in younger ones. So scratching to the point of inflicting pain on purpose, where it's bleeding. And we have some kids that have some, cutting cuticles, anxious behaviors. But what I've seen when it's self-harm, it is frequent and constant to cause pain or bleeding. There's hair pulling. Trichotillomania is what this is called, and this is pulling out one's hair as a response to stress. It does happen. Different severity levels too. Some kids have it so severe that there's actual physical chunks of their hair out. So you're going to want to also determine severity there. Hitting or banging. I have seen this in young, like self-punishing. I've seen this also with children that maybe their verbal expression is not that developed. To get relief, they are hitting their head. I've had children like punching their legs, like hurting themselves, can be one thing as well. And then we did talk about the head banging too. We know that from a developmental perspective, like the brain should always be protected. So we don't want a closed head injury or something like that. But I have had kids that even in session, I'm like making sure safety wise, they're not banging or hitting on purpose to get some of that stimulation from the head banging. Okay. This came from 2024. Rates of self-harm have increased. We can talk about why that happened. My belief is that it's probably always been happening, but people are endorsing it more or talking about it more. And how many of you currently work with teens or whatnot, and they are like talking frequently about peers in their circle that are self-harming? I get that a lot. Like, it's not a big deal because so-and-so does it too. Or I've had kids downplay it so much, like everyone self-harms. Like, why are you making a big deal out of this? This is just what teens do. So we have to think about developmentally where kids are. There's peer pressure. And if they see someone else doing it, that might developmentally be like, oh, I can use this as a coping strategy. 17% of adolescents reported at least once engaging in self-harm, but they're saying that it's definitely more like 25%. And remember, these are people that said, yes, I am doing this. There's so many people that maybe aren't classifying it as self-harm or not endorsing it. Average age of self-harm is 13, with behaviors peaking around 16. This is just average. This is not, everyone's going to fall into this pattern. However, those of you that work with little kids like I do, there is so little to no research on what happens when kids are self-harming younger than 13. There's just not research out there. So maybe someone will be inspired to go out there and research 13 and younger, but they're not really generally, I think it's still a taboo area when self-harm happens lower than 13 years old. Someone said of those 17%, I'm guessing that is within a mental health context. It's a research article, so yes, they probably had to find a sampling of people. So that's why I think the numbers are much higher than that as well. Okay. I like this. This will be in your resources. It's called SOARS. I don't remember. Oh, it stands for suicidal ideation, onset, aftercare, reasons, stages of change. You might also hear self-harm referred to as non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI. If you are looking for a tool for how to have these conversations, these are hard. If you've never had this conversation, practice doing it. Like practice doing it to yourself, practice saying it out loud. I am one that it's awkward. You can tiptoe around it as much as you want, but I use the words, are you cutting yourself? I am straight up with it. And even when we get to suicidal ideation, I will say those terms. Are you having thoughts of ending your life? Are you having thoughts of killing yourself? Because I find with kids, if we're dancing around and we kind of they're like, well, I'm not really sure, right? They're developmentally, we need to be very, very clear with people. Okay. So here's the SOARS pocket card. You could print this, you could put this somewhere, you could put it in your office. And it's basically just how do you determine the level of self-harm? I know self-injury isn't suicidal. Some people may think about suicide when they injure. This is to determine, is this just self-harm or is there suicidal ideations with it? When was the last time you did it? How many times do you self-injure and what do you typically use? And I will straight up ask, do you have access to scissors? Do you have access to razors? How do you take care of the wounds afterwards? This is like, oftentimes I'll get a lot of people like, no one even knows I'm doing it because I do it in spots that parents will never see. This is huge. Have you ever hurt yourself so badly that you needed medical attention, even if you never got it? I've had some kids that self-harm, they cut, and then one time it gets bleeds a lot, or it does require they go and get stitches at the hospital. I have had that happen. So this is so for us clinically to determine the severity, for us to determine the severity. Why do you do this, right? I don't put judgment on it. I just say, oh, what does this do for you? And does it help you? And some people I'll say it's a coping mechanism. And then I'll have other kids say, I'm punishing myself. I have these terrible self doubts about myself. So I'm doing it because I deserve this, right? So I'll get a variety of things. And then, is this something you would like to stop? I have some kids that are like, you can tell me anything, I'm not going to stop it. I need this, right? So then we have to have a lot of discussions around that. And then, have you ever considered stopping? So these are just good if you're looking like, I don't know what to say. Here's some very easy things you can say if you're wondering. Okay. I took a suicidality in with young children, CE. I love this chart. I pull it out with parents. There are different types and severity levels of suicidal ideation. I will get this out with parents. I will get this out with kids. Notice here that it's a thermometer and it starts from no thoughts all the way up to an attempt. Okay. I will get this out with kids and say, where are we? So I'm just going to quickly talk you through the thermometer. So no thoughts, no nothing, right? That would not register on the thermometer. Random intrusive thought. These happen. This is like, for example, you could walk out on a cliff and you're just looking, maybe you're at the Grand Canyon, and you might be thinking, what if I fell in and died, right? That does not mean that you want to end your life. It's just a random thought, like, okay, or what if I jumped off, right? You don't want to jump off, but a thought came into your brain. A thought is just a thought. Then there's those, we move up a little bit more to thoughts of morbidity. So do your thoughts revolve around like life ending, right? I'll have some kids that I don't think they are in the active or acting suicidal, but they're just like, oh, I hate my life type of thing. I wish I weren't alive. Okay, well, then we have to unpack what that means, right? And I will unpack that with kids. Sometimes I'm like, what does that mean when you say you don't want to be alive? Depending on their developmental age, it sometimes means I want this feeling to go away. I don't like what I'm sitting with right now. Does not mean they don't want to be on this earth any longer, but for how many of you have worked with a kid that says, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill myself? right? We need to know that kids express themselves in ways, take it seriously, but also put it somewhere on this thermometer. It happens often. So then we've got to the thoughts of morbidity. Then we move into, this is good for adults too. Then we move into suicidal thoughts. I'm going to kill myself. I wish I could kill myself. I don't want to be alive, right? There's no plan, but there's now, it's not just like, oh, life is bad. It's now I'm thinking about how I would die. So that's no intent and plan. Those, but what we just covered are no ideation or passive. I've had some parents that when their kids in passive suicidal thoughts, they think it's an act. They're monitoring them 24 hours a day. They're sitting in their bedroom watching them. And I need to say, okay, that we're not there yet. I very much appreciate your care, but it's too much for your child right now. And this is actually making things worse. We are right here in the passive. I've had some parents that are, which they should take it seriously, right? They're like, I can never trust my child to be alone. I get this out. And I'm like, has it ever raised to active or act? And they said, no. And I said, okay, let's figure out a safety plan in case something is to happen, but we're not in the active or act right now. Okay, then we move up into more active. I have thought about how I'm going to die. I haven't done it, right? But I have thought about what happens if I go into the bathtub and go under the water for an extended period of time. I've never done it, but I've thought about it. So there's that. We're now starting to think of like methods in which it would happen. That's when it's starting to get a little more into the active. Then we move into suicidal intent. I'm going to like a statement. I've had some kids say that I'm going to die. I'm going to kill myself, but there's no plan yet. Please take this very seriously if you are having the intent statements. Then we move into active. This is when you are going to be really probably sending them to the hospital, or there's going to be some very intensive safety plan, because there's a plan and there's an intent. Tomorrow I'm going to take pills and overdose. That is a plan. That is a plan. That is a very high level of severity. And then there's attempt if they've tried something. And this, I like this because this is very developmentally appropriate. Have they made a plan, or kids are impulsive? Have they impulsively tried to attempt suicide in an impulsive moment? It's heavy stuff. I have gotten this out. I cannot tell you how many times. This will be in your resources. It's a good tool and it's child friendly, right? Like it's got colors and we talk about it. And you can see this, they've taken this and adapted it from the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. It happens in young children, right? I will give a little case example. When I worked in a school, it's the first time I dealt with a young child having suicidal ideations. There was depression there. We could see it, right? We could see that within the school. One day the child said, I've been thinking I'm going to go on top of my roof and jump off. Red flag, right? That's a plan. Also remember, just because something doesn't seem plausible, if sometimes what the children say is developmentally appropriate. For example, I had a kid say they were going to hang themselves with toilet paper. We know that that would probably not be possible, but to that child, it's very real. That to me is a plan with intent, right? So I think that it's very important to have these conversations. This child I'm thinking of was actively having these thoughts. When I leave school today, I'm going to go do this. It was a very heartbreaking situation. It's the first time I saw this. I was probably like 25 years old. And the kid was saying, I don't want this to happen. I don't want these thoughts, right? And so we said, we actually can't have you leave school. Like the kid was going to take the bus home or something. We said, someone has to come and pick you up and take you to somewhere where you can be safe. Parent came, parent was like not having it. They're like, no, this is just kid stuff, was not taking it seriously. We had like a 3-hour meeting with this parent and we said, we can't force you to take your child to the hospital, but we will be documenting this. And the principal actually made the executive decision. if we don't get some sort of paperwork that you took the child and they're safe to come back to school, we're not gonna allow the child back on Monday. It was a Friday. Parent had to take their child to the psych ER. We did not feel comfortable the level that it was with just the parent doing nothing. So that was a good thing of being in a school. We could say that, but not everyone's going to do that, right? So that these are very hard conversations. And then Rachel and I are big, like, take your child to the ER if this is an immediate crisis situation. And I'll have some parents say, I don't want to. And I'm like, that is your choice, but it is against my clinical advice that you're not taking your child. And I will document in the notes, I suggested that the child be taken to an emergency facility. And of course, we're going to get into safety planning. I will have safety plans for this too. I will tell you, at least in DC, there was not many psych ERs for children that you could take them to. I've had some parents wait 24 hours to get seen. Then they just release them. It's not great, but it needs to happen sometimes. I've had some kids that just that experience alone was enough that they were willing to, like, engage more in treatment with me. They're like, I never want to go back to the hospital. That was not good. Yeah. So there are times where we do have to say, this is an immediate safety crisis. Please take them to the hospital. Okay. You will have a link to this. It's in this drive. I use this for kids' personal crisis plan, safety plan. Some kids go into crisis for, like, maybe it's emotional dysregulation. I fill this out with the kids and then we make copies. So you'll get a copy of this. It says, I notice I'm triggered when. So we'll write, I'm triggered when, I'm trying to think of an example here. I'm triggered when school is overwhelming. I'm triggered when I am in math class, right? It can be as specific as you need to be. I'm triggered when I'm at home by myself at nighttime. So we'll put the triggers. Good ways to distract myself are. Distraction is a very good thing when kids are having intrusive thoughts or they, like, just need to not be thinking of these things, right? So sometimes I'll have kids say, ways to distract me are playing video games or drawing or walking my dog. I'm just making up things here. Safe people I can reach out to are, I always give them my information for being a safe person if I feel that's appropriate. Oftentimes they're like, oh, I didn't know if I was in crisis, I could reach out to you. Does not mean I'm going to be available for them, right? I'm going to give them extra steps. But safe people I can reach out to are, sometimes it's not a parent. I've had some kids say, my parents are not the people. Maybe it's a grandma or an aunt or a friend. Things when I help me are, what are 3 coping mechanisms and ways to keep myself and my space safe? Take a walk, have an adult sit with me, eat a snack, stuff like that. And then, of course, I give the 741 crisis number, and then 988 has been a wonderful campaign. Make sure your kids, I've had clients, you tell me I've texted the 988 number. And then I'm like, whoa, let's talk about why you were texting the 988 number. But they're like, oh, I was going through a tough time and I wanted to self-harm. And so someone texted me through that. Okay, I'm glad that you're utilizing that resource. If you're making a crisis plan, document, and then make copies. I'll give lots of copies. And if I'm making a crisis plan, the parents are going to come into the session and go through this with me. They need to know what the crisis plan is. If school is a place of crisis, the school needs to have the crisis plan. If they go to grandparents' house, other people's house, whoever is important to know what the safety plan is based on when they go into crisis or safety should have a copy of the safety plan. I have some parents that are like, our safety plan is right up on the refrigerator. And they're like, we talked about it with the whole family. Siblings know about it. It's important to know, right? So I like this one because it's not, like, very boring. It's a fun, I don't want to call it safety plan fun, but it's more child friendly. Okay. That's that. Okay. Does anyone in the chat put questions if you have questions on self-harm, suicide, suicide planning, all that stuff, please put that in the chat. We have about, well, so actually we're gonna have a lot of time for Q&A. Let's leave probably 30 minutes, but okay. Now, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked a lot about cases. We've talked about working with kids. We've talked a lot about things. But now what do you do when you're in this situation, right? It's like, yeah, we've heard all of this stuff, but what do we do? So I'm going to talk about some of the first ones, and then Rachel's going to talk to you. She's the liability insurance queen. She's going to talk to you about liability insurance, but this stuff's not easy. So please do not ever feel like you have to handle these things alone. If you go into any code of ethics for mental health professionals, it's going to give you the steps to take. But there are so many times where it's a gray area. It's like, well, do I report? Do I not report? It's not like you have like a magic 8-ball that will, you'll shake up and it will tell you exactly what to do. These are nuanced, complicated situations. So if you are ever in an ethical dilemma, which I will tell you, you will be in an ethical dilemma, there is no way around getting outside of an ethical dilemma. What can you do? Help, right? You need to seek help. It's okay. Please do never not seek help because you feel like, oh my God, I'm incompetent or I'm embarrassed. No. This happens. We're humans, and there's times I'm just like, I don't know either, right? So seek supervision. That's step one. How many of you get regular supervision? That's a whole nother topic we could talk about, how all supervision is not created equal. If you don't have a clinical supervisor, make sure you have a colleague you can talk to. Maybe you're part of a peer consultation group. You need to have someone that's also a mental health professional to seek supervision. When I worked in a school, I could bounce ideas off of the principal, but the principal did not operate under a mental health code of ethics. The principal is a mandated reporter. The principal didn't have a clinical license that they could lose based on this. Your license is so important. Don't lose it for anyone or anything, right? So seek supervision, whatever that is, whether that's through clinical supervision, peer, like I suggested, but you need to talk these things through. Consultation might be like, hey, you just do a one-off consult with someone. You're like, hey, I have this case and I really need to just talk to you about this case. It's hard, right? I don't know what to do, or I'm really struggling between choosing to do this or that. So make sure you have points of contact that you trust and you feel like they will give you solid, good advice. Document. Anytime anything comes up that's like code of ethics, legal, gray area, you're going to document it with as much details as you can. For example, you called CPS. What day did you call CPS? Who did you talk to? Right? Document also, like, say you had a disclosure. A lot of you might do notes in some sort of like electronic health record system. So important that you're doing those mental health exams, right? Or it's like, was the client a danger to self or others? You need to give documentation there. Don't say, yes, everything was fine if everything's not fine. So make sure you're giving the details there as well. Anytime I have to break confidentiality to talk to parents, I put that in as a whole separate client contact. Contacted the parents on this day. If I have to talk to the school or the school has to contact me, document. I was in the school, now I'm on the other side. I talk with schools a lot, right? Because oftentimes it's not just happening at home, it's sometimes school is the trigger. Or they're really having a hard time in school. So document. You cannot document enough because God forbid you get subpoenaed, your records get subpoenaed. And if you don't have anything in there, you could be the one that is going to be asked questions. And if you don't have it in there, they're going to say, well, didn't document it. It did not happen. You can call your state board and ask for a consult. Like, hey, I'm not sure what to do here. What do I do? If they can't help you, they will tell you what resources you can use. They'll say, hey, maybe call CPS and get a consult. You can call CPS if you're not sure. I have a supervisee and we weren't sure. I said, just call and say, this is what I'm dealing with. Is this reportable? And they took I don't know if they opened anything, but they took the call. So make sure you're documenting, make sure you're consulting with the board if you need to. And then Rachel is going to leave you with liability insurance. What do you do here? You need to have some sort of insurance to cover you. And she'll tell you about, like, a lot of agencies will have their own insurance, but then how do you get your own? So Rachel, take it away with that.
Yeah. So this is a thing that I have a lot of feelings about because I have seen it in action. So agencies will always say, like, oh, yes, you're on our liability insurance. But at the end of the day, their liability insurance is for them and it protects them. And so if throwing you under the bus will protect the agency, you are going to get thrown under the bus. And so that's where I think it's just incredibly important to have your own liability insurance. There's a lot of places that do this research, look things up. It's also not that expensive, honestly. Like, my liability insurance covers a lot. They're wonderful and they actually don't cost that much. Um,
It's
but
worth the small cost just for
yeah.
peace of mind. Um,
Mm.
I will say Rachel's been in, like, the clinical world a lot longer than I have. I did not have liability insurance my own when I was at schools and stuff. Knock on wood, nothing happened, because I was like, they'll take care of it. But now I'm wishing I did, because what if they didn't give me legal representation at the school that I worked for? Or what if they didn't give me enough, right? And I'm paying thousands of dollars in legal fees. So learn from my mistakes. I wish I would have taken these steps. And then also, like I said, some group practices will say, yes, we have a blanket insurance policy, but ask questions. How much does this cover? What does it cover? But I feel much better now that, well, I also have my own private practice, but when I went into group, I got my own policy as well. So keep talking, Rachel.
Yeah, no, and that it's so important. So like I got my liability insurance while I was working at Catholic Charities, right? And Catholic Charities has a very robust insurance policy. But I learned very quickly that they were there to protect Catholic Charities. And that also like goes down to even, I have called my liability insurance more than once and been like, hey, I need a consult with a lawyer about X, Y, or Z that is happening. And they get me a lawyer. I talk with that person and they go through the legal aspects of it. Like, they're not doing anything clinical, but they walk me through the legal steps I have to take or the legal steps that I must avoid. And I found that really helpful because when I have called the liability insurance of an agency, their answers always go back to protecting the agency, not about what I should do clinically, or how I should handle that clinically. And having your own liability insurance also opens up that door. And you don't have to pay for those consults under your liability insurance. Like, you can consult with a lawyer and it's part of your insurance. That's part of what you're paying for. And also these are lawyers usually who have been working on this stuff for a really long time. And so they know what they're talking about. They know the ins and outs of child welfare. They know the ins and outs of contentious divorce cases and subpoenas and all of that. I've also had my liability insurance lawyer has squashed a subpoena or two for me, where my agency was not going to do that. And they sent a lawyer. They showed up with a lawyer. They sent a lawyer to be there on times when I have had to testify, whereas no agency I've ever had has even offered to send a lawyer. Um, and so like that's a huge benefit. And I felt so much more comfortable having a lawyer present in some of those areas because I mean, I'm a social worker. The law is not my area of expertise. um, and so I just highly recommend get your own liability insurance, cover yourself, and do not assume that your agency is going to cover you if it comes down to it.
I will ask, how many of you have been subpoenaed and had to appear in court ever? I have been subpoenaed 3 times and had to appear in court twice, but I'm just curious. I see a few yeses. Um, it was probably the most horrifying experience, professionally, that I've ever had to deal with. Um, I also, of course, was very young in my career and I got subpoenaed. Oh, someone said 14. So yes, it happens, right? This is like, you're not immune to it. Um, I don't know why ignorance is bliss, but I was like, oh, I'm just not gonna ever have to be subpoenaed, even though I got subpoenaed 3 times, all were for CPS calls that I made as part of the school. Um, and I had to go to court twice. Um, I worked in a public school that has a legal counsel, and they still like did not send me with a lawyer. They basically said, "Here, yes, we will. You got the subpoena. You have to appear." Um, it was very scary, and I can tell you the 2 times that I had to go. One was I reported psychological abuse and physical abuse. It was a religious psychological abuse and physical abuse case. I got subpoenaed. I was one of many people who reported, and I had to go say that, what I reported, because they were going to probably remove the children from parental, from the guardian. They were going to remove them and give rights to foster care. I will tell you, I got sworn in, all that stuff. It was so stressful. And then I also was sitting eye to eye with the person that I reported. So there was that too. Talk about intimidation. Lawyers are intimidating. They are there to basically find holes in anything. I literally just said and I probably was baffling like this too because it was hard, but I just gave exactly the details that I reported. I answered the questions. If I couldn't answer the question, I said, I don't know. I don't have access to that information. What I wish I had done differently was I wish someone had gone with me. I went by myself both times. I wish like either my husband or a supervisor or someone would at least have come with me. They could sit in the waiting room because I was shooken up after that. So that was one time. The other time was again reporting. And the second time I went, I had to also be face to face with the person that I reported. And this lawyer was trying to tear me up, like just really going after me as lawyers do because she was defending her client. It was scary. It was not good. And I will say, utilize support after that. I did not go to work after that. It was a school day, but I took the day. It was very, very hard. Very, very hard. And also what's good is if you do have to go testify, if you have this liability insurance, they will let you talk to someone. Mine has 2 to 4 hours of legal talking with a lawyer. They will tell you, here's what you can prepare for, here's the questions you might be asked. Here's what you should say. Here's what you shouldn't say. So you really want that help if God forbid you need that help. It's not easy. My heart goes out to the person that had to go 14 times. It's just not fun. No one's like, I want to wake up and go to court today. Well, unless that's your job, right? Some people do. That's literally they're going every day, but this is not the fun part of the job. So please, 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 I hope at least if you don't get your yes, Rachel said the only time she's questioned her career choices is when I get a subpoena. I'm not someone that likes conflict, and in courtrooms there's lots of conflict. It's not, for me, it was not pleasant. Some people can deal with that. I was not someone that could deal with that. Use these opportunities to please lean on those people that you need support with. And this is not usually, oh, I went to court, it's over, it's done. You'll be thinking about it. You'll be anxious about it. Like, these are not great things. So please, 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 utilize the resources that you have. And if nothing, at least ask your agency, hey, what am I covered under? If they're like, you're not covered under anything, go and sign up for that liability insurance immediately. So always, always, always use supports as you need to. This stuff's hard. And I will also say someone can sue you for anything. It doesn't mean it's valid, right? So someone could just be disgruntled and be like, I'm going to put into a complaint to the board. What do you do then? You didn't do anything wrong, but anyone can sue you, go to court at any time, and try to come after your license, because there are some people out there that are very power hungry, and that's how they retaliate. So God forbid that would ever happen, but that's our plug for please get insurance. It's at least for your own security, like, hey, I have this in case I need it. And that is it for our stuff, for our content. Heavier than we probably wanted, but I will say, like, what this is ethics, right? So it's not like we're talking about therapeutic play, right? Or something fun. So we will be doing Q&A here in just a second, but I want you to know that we have lots of resources here. If you're like a nerd and you're like, hey, I want to go read these different things, we did get our information from these sources. So just FYI, here they are. Got lots of them. And Bonnie is now going to kick off. We've had lots of questions. Bonnie, go ahead, and if you just want to start reading some of the questions, and Rachel and I can decide who takes what. But I think that's good. We have, we'll say what we have. We'll do 15, 20 minutes for questions, and then we will wrap up and do our final logistics. But read us some of the questions that you have gathered.
Yes, a lot of you had very interesting questions. So we're gonna kind of go back to the beginning. I know someone did have a few questions as far as how do we ethically handle situations where a teen discloses pregnancy?
That is a great question. This is going to depend. This is when we say social work is political, because there are now state laws where you might have to report. I have always said, I have never had a child or teen disclose pregnancy to me. Check with your state laws. Absolutely check with your state laws. There are some states where you have to report this, like, no matter what. But I have worked in states where it's not disclosable. You don't have to tell parents if the child, unless you can report to CFSA if the baby is in danger, or if the minor client is in danger, right? Maybe they are being coerced into having sex, or they were raped and this was a product of that. So it depends, but you have to do safety. You have to do safety checks, and in some states it's disclosable, and others, I'm of course going to encourage the teen to talk to someone about this, because at some point someone's going to have to know and have a plan. But that's a really tricky one. Rachel, do you have any advice on that?
I think that that's really it. Like, it really depends on where you are located. And, in the past, I've had a teen disclose that they were pregnant and they were going to get an abortion. And because of the state laws, I could not say anything to their parents without their consent. And so our therapy took a very interesting turn, because it turned, like, I became, a support, and we also had to process through the abortion process as well. But I couldn't tell the parents that. If the parents knew I had withheld that information, they would have been furious, but legally I could not disclose that. I think it also really depends on age, right? So if a 12-year-old is telling you that they're
Yes.
pregnant, generally, universally, that's a CPS report, and you need to talk to the parents and etc. If a kid is 16, well, now we have a very, very different conversation on our hands.
Also, age of the partner, I think, matters.
Mm.
Sometimes I've called for CPS, like, two minors having sex with another, and they're like, we don't take that. But Rachel tried to report this, right? Like, when an older person, when it's statutory rape, that then actually might be a CPS and a criminal. But some of you might live in very red states where now there's new laws around abortion and pregnancy where you could lose your license if you don't. I know the mental health professions are really trying to fight this, because clients do have a right to confidentiality, but that's to be determined, I think, in some of these states where, yeah. Good question, though.
Thank you. And if I can just add to that, I know I've had a bit of experience with that as well. Of course, it does depend on what state you're in.
And Bonnie's in
But
Texas, if you're wondering where she's at.
yes. I'm in Texas. So also just kind of like encouraging and educating the client to speak with a medical professional. And, from there, you're not necessarily giving information or crossing boundaries depending on what area you're in. Um, but you have a medical professional being able to educate them as well. And of course, depending on the state and what they would have to ethically follow, then that would be in their hands as well. So kind of just thinking out of the box of like, okay, what other professionals are able to help me or help the client, and referring them to that as well.
And anyone that's pregnant should be getting medical care. So they should
Yeah.
be, we should be referring and working with a medical professional. But how many teens don't disclose because they're terrified? So,
This also gets really tricky with documentation, because if you are in a state where
mhm.
there is a lot of red tape, et cetera, around abortion, and somebody comes in and discloses they've had an abortion to you, you can't obviously say anything because of confidentiality. It has already happened, it's in the past. But I'm very careful about what I put in the record, because should that get subpoenaed, should that go to court, you could really get you could get your client in a lot of trouble for having that information in the record.
Yes. Thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So what are the best practices for including electronic disclosures in emails to ensure that we have confidentiality and informed consent when there's a lot of digital communication with the clients?
Yeah, I mean, emails can get hacked at any time, right? So it's in my consent forms through my private practice that this is, I do my best I use compliance software, right? Like, also, if you are on your own, make sure that you have telehealth professional liability, and that you also are using platforms that are HIPAA compliant. And it does cost a little bit more, but it's worth it. Like, there's certain platforms that are HIPAA compliant and others that are not. So that's what I say for that. I've also seen some people put at the bottom of their signature, like, if you receive this in error, this is confidential information. So that's just my advice. Rachel, do you have advice on what you do for documents? And I try to do everything through the portal. I have a patient portal because that is HIPAA compliant. So of course I'll email and stuff, but then I'll say I'm going to upload this form to the portal.
Yeah. So currently in both of the places I work, we have a standard signature. And that standard signature goes over, the confidentiality of email cannot be guaranteed. If this was sent in error, like, please disregard right away. But we are, my one place I work is moving towards a portal, and then all of our communication, just like a doctor's office, will go through the portal. Which I think is going to be hard for some of my older clients, just because, they finally got used to email. But I very clear, and like both places use Outlook, which Outlook is HIPAA compliant. And so that's why we use it. And it's still always a possibility. And so I think that that's in the signature that both agencies have, is that you cannot guarantee the
We do our
confidentiality.
best, right? But how many times have you all gotten in the mail, your information has been hacked, right? Like, we can't control that there's hackers out there and whatnot. We do our best to comply. But also make sure that your work is doing HIPAA compliant stuff. I worked in a school, and I know a few people on here, like, teachers give out their personal cell phones, they're communicating with parents, like, they don't have the same code of ethics that we do. So I do text families, but I use a HIPAA compliant texting software. I make my calls off of that, because that can be subpoenaed as well. So just know anything that you're texting the clients could be subpoenaed as well. So we live in a very tech savvy world, so it's easy to just, communicate via text, but just be mindful of, like, who are we texting and what context is it HIPAA compliant.
Yes, thank you. And I know, Rachel, you kind of touched on this when you first started discussing your case. So how can you, I guess, provide us some information on how we can deal with families who have very different ideas of what the expectation of therapy is and the services?
Yeah. So generally speaking, I'm a pretty straight shooter when it comes to therapy. I have said directly to families, if you want sunshine and rainbows and somebody to tell you things are perfect, I am not your person. You are coming to me for a reason, and I want to help you with that reason. So in the same vein, I'm generally pretty direct about what therapy can and cannot do. Um, and as I'm sure many of us have had, why can't you fix my kid? Things like that. Well, I'm not here to fix your kid. And I'm very direct about that. Like I tell them, like, this is what I can and cannot do. I cannot snap my fingers and make this all better. And I will also talk about the expectation of like what therapy looks like. So if there's parents who are like, I should be in every session, that is not how I work. That is not how this is, especially with older adolescents, teens. That's not going to work for them. That's not going to work for me. And I just
And
reiterate,
some providers will do that. That might be more like a family therapy, right? Like I
yeah,
had a client's parent say, I wouldn't allow them, and you do have to think of this. I do often think of this. Like it's hard to send your child into a room. They close the door. It's like what is going on? But we have a code of ethics. We are professionals. I talk about all of that. I had a parents I would never let them in the doctor's room by themselves. I'm like, I'm not doing any physical examinations ever, never, ever.
mm,
And if you are looking to sit into the sessions, like I'm not the right provider for you. Maybe family therapy, or maybe there is a provider that's going to do that, but I am not the person.
yeah. I will also say directly, I am on so and so's team. Like, yes, that means I'm here to support the family, but I'm on their team. I'm not the family therapist. I'm not your therapist. I'm not dad's therapist, mom's therapist. I am their therapist, and that is my role, and that is the lane I'm going to stay in.
And I've had to say sometimes, I think it's best that you get a parent coordinator or you do some parenting work, because this is getting blurry for us right now. Or um, I've also had some clients. Rachel and I worked in DC at a very high income level of clientele when we worked there, and a lot of people were using therapy as I don't know how to, like, they were just outsourcing everything. They go to piano, they go to sports, and they go to therapy. They would have all pairs drop them off. They would have nannies, and we have had too many times say, this isn't going to work without your input. This is not a babysitter, right? Like this is a therapeutic process. So like also telling, like, I'm very grateful that you're trusting me, but there needs to be like some buy-in and just very clear of what therapy is versus what therapy isn't.
Yes, thank you. And I know that kind of jumps into the next question as well, as far as how you manage confidentiality between the two sessions of an individual session or a joint session. So if you can kind of just touch a little bit on that, since we were kind of discussing it already.
So I will do joint sessions, but not every session will be like that, right? I am not a family therapist. So I will tell parents that we will sometimes have a family session when it's appropriate. So we will schedule that. I also do, most of the time, I will have like maybe the parents check in for the first 5 or 10 minutes or the last 5 or 10 minutes. So there's components of it, but very rarely is every single session. Unless of course we're working on a skill. Maybe we're working on communicating with mom and like we need to practice that skill. Or I also have done I was doing some exposure work around eating, and eating was a very family time, so family had to be in the session. The whole family was there. We were eating different foods and whatnot, because that was the skill we were targeting. It was more of a skills based versus like a psychotherapy talk session. So that's kind of where I go with that. Rachel, what are
Yeah,
your thoughts?
I think it's also really topic dependent. So when I'm working in OCD, parents are highly involved in that because I need the parents there to learn how to not reassure. I need the parents there to help them with their homework exposures, etc. And so I have a little bit more interaction with the parents in session in those cases. If I'm working on trauma or grief, that interaction with parents is very different. Also depending on the trauma or the grief. But I tend to, if I am doing like what I did with this family, where I had, you know, one session that was individual and then half of an individual, half a parent session, essentially. Um, I took, I had two notes. That's just the way my brain worked. And so like I had a list of like what we were working on as like the for mom to come in and talk about what we were working on, and a list of like what the individual session was about. And having two separate pieces of paper was really helpful for me to just make sure I wasn't crossing those lines unless the client crossed them, right? Unless, she said directly, like, I want to talk about this thing that we were just talking about. Okay, fine, but I'm not going to bring that up unless it's a safety issue. But I needed to have a very separate thing in my brain, because otherwise I was like, this is gonna get real confused. So I also, along these same lines, I have had it where parents are really contentious or parents are just really disruptive to therapy. And then we get a parent coordinator or we get a family therapist. And I don't communicate with the parents anymore at the behest of the communicator or the coordinator or the other therapist. I communicate with that person and they communicate with the parents. And we may do like team meetings with the parents, but my communication with the parents regularly turns into he said, she said, people hearing different things. And so it's just incredibly unhelpful.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly touch on something someone asked. It's very similar. Tips on teenagers who drive themselves to sessions. Should this be something that's discouraged? Age does matter. I have had kids, juniors, seniors. I have very little contact with the parent. It's not necessary because there's not safety issues. The teen is going off to college next year, right? Yes, parents had to sign consent and they were part of that first thing, but that there's that agreement, right? Like there's a very big difference, I think, between a 17-year-old driving themselves to come and see me and a 12-year-old, right? So also in maturity level, then I've had some 17-year-olds that parents are very involved because maturity wise, they're very, very young. But I have some parents, I see them once and it's not necessary for them to be involved because it's just that's not necessary for the treatment. Like maybe they're working around school stress, right? So like, no, the parent doesn't need to be involved. And I've had some parents that are very open, like if you need me, engage me. Otherwise, I do handle the financials, right? I will pay whatever is necessary, but it's okay that you leave me out of it. I've had some kids, I actually love when I have very responsible teens that they cancel the appointments on their own. They feel very empowered sometimes to do that, or like some parent, we say this like on a situational basis, determine what level the parents are going to be involved based on the cases that you have. But yeah, I have clients drive themselves all the time, and that's what it is, right? And they are able maturity wise to handle.
Yes, thank you. And I know this case that we were discussing was a very tough case, right? As far as the disclosures that were being made. So can you share with us as far as like what self-care strategies or what did you do to kind of continue your resilience in this case to continue forward, whether it was in practice or also outside of work as well?
Yeah. So great question. This particular case is why I started doing solid core, because I needed a very hard workout to get some of my emotions out in the situation. And it I I needed that physical outlet. So that was a big help. The other thing is I had a really great coworker who um had also just kind of been through the trenches of therapy, and so she was just really helpful in letting me vent. Like they were not supervision sessions by any means. And at the time I honestly did not have quality supervision. I had to find that elsewhere. But I found that having that person to vent to was incredibly helpful. And also like helped me get my mind right in what I needed to do next. And I'm not gonna lie, there were a couple of days where I had a glass of scotch and sat in the dark and cried. And that was that too. And that was necessary as well. So, I think it's balanced like most things. But I do highly recommend getting good supervision. That was something that was really hard in that case because I was lacking a good supervisor. And I was lacking anyone else around me who had dealt with anything even similar. Like at that point in time, I had the most experience with that kind of case. And that was not great. So good supervision, good people to vent to, move your body, do something nice for yourself.
And I obviously did not have this exact case. I've had very hard cases before. I still always, in the back of my mind, I'm like, someday I might have a client that I lose to suicide or to violence or something. So it is always in the back of my head, especially when we're working with kids. But for me, I used to like really take work home with me, and it does, right? But what has helped for me is radical acceptance that I can be a helper in this person's life, but I cannot change everything. Like I have to accept that things are going to happen the way they do, and I can be of assistance, but I can't give my life and my identity. At the end of the day, they're not my children, right? Like we are with them maybe an hour a week. So like putting that into perspective is like, I'm going to do the best I can. But I need to radically accept that some of these things are out of my hands. And like, it's a tough pill to swallow, but it is what it is. So with that, I think Bonnie, maybe one last question before we wrap up.
Yes, and I just want to mention, like in the comments, yes, we're not actual superheroes, we're not actual magicians, right? We can't do it all. Of course, our practice is very, very broad, and we're here to help, but we do need to take care of ourselves. So I really appreciate you sharing the case as well as sharing how you all take care of yourselves, and hopefully, at Agents of Change, we're super big on taking care of ourselves and sharing those ideas with you all. So I hope you're able to take something from that.
And
The
one
next
last
question.
thing, before our last question, I will just put this plug out there. As Bonnie's saying, we say take care of yourselves. Sometimes taking care of yourselves is leaving that agency or leaving that place. Rachel and I have just transitioned. Like sometimes that's not the right place of work for you at that time, or you're just like, you need a change, and that's okay. Sometimes the agency is not supporting you in the way that you need. So if you need to walk away from that, that is okay too.
Yes,
And sometimes
definitely.
that also means handing clients off and not sticking with someone. And I know that we all have a real hard time with that. But just want to throw that out there too. Sometimes taking care of yourself means giving up a client and giving them to someone else.
And I think a great way of thinking of that as well from another perspective is something is pulling me, somewhere else. Maybe because another client in another agency or another area that I'm going to needs me, right? Like I've already done my services here. I've already done, the changes that need to be made in the agency itself or the program. And then of course, move on to what's needed next.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.